Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Director-General of the BBC has admitted that some of the corporation's highest-profile journalists have been paid too much. Publishing a review of how some editors, correspondents and presenters are paid, Lord Hall said the corporation hadn't been idle in tackling gender inequality. The report by the auditors PwC criticises the BBC for a lack of transparency about the basis for pay decisions. Here's our media editor, Am Incorrigible.
The BBC likes to cover the news, but hates being in the headlines itself. That's one reason it resisted the disclosure of salaries for high earners last summer.
Busy day for you. Thanks for coming in.
But today, with the zeal of, as he put it, a convert, the Director-General of the BBC said he now wanted much more transparency.
I want us on pay to be the most transparent organisation because I believe that transparency will lead to greater trust in the system for women and men to know that they're paid fairly.
And is equal pay best achieved by reducing the pay of some men or by raising the pay of some women?
You've got to do both. You've got to take down some of the outliers, some of the very highly paid men. I think that's important. But also you've got to look, as we are doing, at the lower paid people.
His plan to address both the gender pay gap, that's the difference between the average pay of men and women within an organisation, and the legal requirement of equal pay for equal work includes pay cuts for some men and pay rises for some women and also men, a new framework for pay bands, and a radical increase in transparency. Tomorrow, Carrie Gracie, who resigned her post as China editor in protest at unequal pay, appears before a select committee of MPs. Along with Gracie, Eleanor Bradford is one of hundreds of BBC women who have formally complained. Today, she explained why she's gone public.
I actually cited equal pay and I said that I wanted an equal pay review. I was helped by my male colleagues who told me what they were on, and when I did that I had an immediate £5 pay rise. Although that didn't take me up to the level that some of my male peers were earning when they were still doing identical jobs.
The BBC says that the competition for talent is now in sport, drama and entertainment rather than news.
The levels of pay for the star journalists are way too high. There isn't really a market. ITV is not in that market. Sky isn't in that market. There are very few in the news business the way the BBC is. So I think those levels will start to come down now.
But this rationale doesn't cut it with women who say they've been wronged for years. One member of the BBC Women group within the organisation applauded Tony Hall's proactive thinking, but says it hasn't trickled down the organisation.
There are too many peculiar decisions still being made by tin pot tyrants in chinos who just haven't had the memo yet. Women deserve equal pay for equal work.
From its inception under Lord Reith, the BBC has been a moral project. It's therefore held to higher ideals than most of its rivals. And that is why, though its record is far superior to the national average, these headlines are hurting so much. As Director-General, Tony Hall has undoubtedly done more than most of his predecessors on this issue of gender equality. But while he wants to talk about the future, his loudest critics are still furious about both the present and the past. With some huge salaries across the BBC either still static or secret, and a fiery select committee hearing predicted for tomorrow, BBC News will continue to be the news for some time yet. Am Incorrigible, BBC News.
The BBC has become embroiled in a fresh row over gender pay after a review found men were paid more than women. The Director-General, Lord Hall, said there was no evidence of gender bias, but he accepted that things would have to change. Juliet Bremner reports.
They are the faces and voices that deliver BBC News, now in the uncomfortable position of making headlines themselves, as the BBC struggles to find a way of diffusing anger over the pay gap between men and women. A review into more than 800 on-air staff, including correspondents and presenters, found there was a difference of 6.8% in pay, but concluded no evidence of gender bias. The Director-General believes they now have a framework to move forward.
You've got to have here a rational, data-driven way of people judging how much they're paid and what they should be paid.
That's the way forward, but right now Do you accept there is inequality between men and women?
I accept that we need to lower some men's pay. I also think, when we now look at the data we've published today, that there are some women's pay we need to raise.
8 days remain before the electorate...
But a group of 170 women, including household names like Michelle Hussein, are rejecting today's findings. Woman's Hour presenter Jane Garvey told us it's a systematic failure.
It's not really about these eye-watering six-figure salaries, which some people at the BBC are lucky enough to have. That is way beyond most people's experience. I don't expect sympathy. I just want people outside the media, in all forms of working life, to think about what's happening to them at work, what's been happening to their mum or their sister or their friend. Because if this has been going on at the BBC, I'm absolutely certain it's still happening everywhere else.
The solution so far has been to cut the pay of the highest earning male stars. But the BBC women are wanting more, back pay, an adjustment to their pensions for what they claim are years of inequality. Tomorrow, Carrie Gracie will explain to MPs why she felt her pay was so unfair she had to resign as China editor. Another indication that women at the BBC are in no mood to compromise. Juliet Bremner, ITV News.
Some of the BBC's highest profile female staff have for months been locked in dispute with the corporation over claims that it pays them less than their male counterparts. Earlier this month, his China editor, Carrie Gracie, accused the broadcaster of illegally paying women less to do the same job. But today, a review commissioned by the BBC found that there had been no gender bias in decision-making about pay, but there were some anomalies. It all started last summer when the BBC was forced to publish a list of its 96 top-earning stars, which revealed that women made up just 1/3 of the on-air presenters receiving £150,000 a year or more. Since then, controversy has raged, intensifying this month when Carrie Gracie resigned as China editor after learning she was paid substantially less than her male counterparts. 6 top-earning male presenters have now taken pay cuts, and some women have been offered pay rises. Today, a BBC review by PricewaterhouseCoopers found a 6.8% gender pay gap, but no evidence of gender bias in pay decision-making. It said there was a lack of clarity and openness about the basis for pay decisions. BBC Women, a group which represents 170 female BBC staff, said it had no confidence in the conclusions. One female presenter disclosed she'd asked for a pay rise, but had been told the BBC didn't do equal pay. I asked the BBC Director General if the corporation had illegally been paying some women less.
No, not illegally. I don't believe.
Never illegally?
I don't believe there has been illegality in the BBC. What is absolutely unacceptable in any workplace is for someone to say, the BBC doesn't do equality, or go away, you're a woman, you won't be... You know, that is just not right, and that is not the workplace that I want. That's what I want to change, and this is a cultural change.
Do you now, today, apologise to the women who have been underpaid over the years here at the BBC?
If anybody has had a situation where their pay has been kind of dramatically or in some ways not been paid correctly, then of course I do. Of course I do.
I mean, that has been proven.
No, but you know, I'll do it specific cases. If there are specific cases and you want to bring these people in here, and I will say to them, I'm sorry it's been like that. It shouldn't be like that.
That sounds like you don't believe those cases exist.
No,
I'm just inviting you to apologise to the women who say they have been underpaid.
If women, I'm being very direct, if there were women, we've had over 90 cases already of people who said we've had to have pay adjustments, I'm sorry that they had to go through that process to do that.
So you're sorry to those 90 women?
Yes, I am. Well, some of them, as it happens, are men.
Well, you're sorry to them too?
But I'm sorry to them too. Of course I am, because you know I'm responsible for this organisation. You know, one human being to another, that should not happen. And I want to get these things right. And if there are people who feel, watching this, that their pay is not right and they want to raise it, please do. Don't write anonymously or whatever. Tell us these issues. We want to deal with them.
You're proposing a pay cap for presenters, but even after the reported £300,000 pay cap, I know you haven't confirmed what the level is, why are presenters paid so much? I mean, are we really worth it?
Well, we're actually putting out, again for consultation, the top of the pay band for presenters we think ought to be £320,000 in news. Presenters are the link between our audiences and ourselves. What we're saying today is, in some cases, in news, we've been paying people too much, because actually the market in news is not the same market that there is in entertainment or drama.
Well, you've said presenters are the link with the audience, but how does it feel to an NHS nurse, for example, watching the BBC News, to find out that those presenters are paid hundreds of thousands of pounds? I mean, how do you justify that to someone paying their licence fee?
Yeah, I get that. I completely understand that, and that's why in the nearly 5 years I've been back at the BBC, we've reduced the pay to top presenters by 40%. The general rate we've paid to presenters we reduced by 25% because I felt we were paying people too much. It's interesting when you survey and you talk to licence fee payers, they want to know their money is being properly spent, but they also then say, but we'd like to see stars on the BBC, we want to see big names there. But to the nurse, I would say that does mean we've got to be able to say to you that in some cases we are paying what we're paying, and we've got to be able to justify that to you, and that's why I think being open about this is important.
What did you think when you heard John Humphrys joking about equal pay, taking the mick out of Carrie Gracie?
I think two things. One is, oh, why? And the second thing is the old rule that people always tell you, if there's a microphone, don't say anything.
What about management pay? I believe you're paid £450,000.
But can I say,
what pay cut have you taken?
No, I haven't. I've had exactly the same pay since I came here. I don't seek any more, I don't seek any less. I'm extremely well paid.
You're not offering to take a pay cut, though?
I'm extremely well paid, and I will leave it at that.
But if John Humphrys is taking a pay cut, why don't you take a pay cut too?
Well,
fair.
I think I am paid properly for what I do, and I'll just leave it at that. What I have been doing with the executive team is also getting to a more gender-balanced executive team. I'm delighted that Charlotte Moore is doing a great job as Director of Content. It's great to have Fran Answorth now as Director of News, Donaldo running Scotland. There are a number of really wonderful women who are in leadership positions at the BBC, and what I want to do in the BBC is make sure they thrive and are successful.
Tony Hall, thank you very much.
Thank you.
After 3 uncomfortable weeks in which it's had little to say in answer to critics of its unequal pay structure, the BBC came back with its own analysis today. With other companies being forced to address their pay gaps this year, the BBC's defence may turn out to be a template for the arguments playing out elsewhere. Now, the report was compiled by the accountants PwC, and you could summarise it as, there is no problem, but yes, we're going to solve it. On the no problem side, the report looks at the pay of news presenters and on-air journalists and finds no evidence of gender bias in pay decision-making. Even though women are paid less on average, it's mostly down to the fact that the women have, on average, arrived more recently, it suggests. More men were taken on in the days when media pay rates were more generous. But the report also says a problem does need solving, that the pay for on-air staff is a mess and needs to be more structured. Our business editor, Helen Thomas, reports.
Public pay packets for high earners, the gender pay gap, and now on-air talent. Questions of pay, fairness and equality have certainly knocked the BBC off balance. Today's report by PwC looked at 824 presenters, editors and correspondents who appear on screen. The gender pay gap between the median of women's salaries and men's was 6.8%. That's lower than the 9.3% for the BBC overall and the national gap of 18.4%. But in 656 lower profile roles, the gap was 12.6%. And for the highest profile, the report found the range of pay was much too wide, with more men at the top than women. But the BBC is trying to address two quite separate issues. The first is the gender pay gap.
Every company with more than 250 employees must now publish various measures of the gap between the average of men's pay and women's. That gap can sometimes be partially explained by skills, by seniority, or by type of work. EasyJet posted a 45% gap because most of its highly paid pilots are men and most of its cabin crew are women. But the BBC is grappling with another issue, equal pay. That's the allegation that men and women haven't been paid equally for doing jobs that are essentially the same, or for work that's of an equal value to the organisation.
It is not an audit of equal pay across the BBC. It is a very particular sort of report that the BBC has ordered, and without being too cynical, it does seem to be the report the BBC wanted. I really hope that other employers and other employees are looking at all this. I'm sure they're bored to tears by the shenanigans at the BBC, I get that completely. But the central thrust of what BBC Women is all about is about telling other people that if it's happened to us, it is almost certainly happening to you or to another woman that you care about.
PwC said they had found no evidence of gender bias in pay decision-making, but it criticised a lack of structure in setting pay and a lack of consistency and transparency. Today, the BBC pledged to address that with a new pay framework, more information on pay, and a faster push towards equal representation of men and women on air. These may be TV presenters with six-figure salaries, but discrimination lawyers say the issues raised are the same as in other equal pay cases.
Well, the principle is the principle. It reminds me very much of the cases that I did on local authority bonuses for manual workers and the women who weren't getting the bonuses, and the question of whether or not the bonuses were representing productivity. And in the past, they might well have been once productive, but in the time that we were doing the cases, they really had just become basic pay, and they were coming up with the usual pay packet. And that's really an analogy here. There may well have been a time when this extra pay was merited, but that was then, and this is now, and they should have therefore changed the pay.
The most eye-catching part of the BBC's response so far has been pay cuts for high-profile men, but that, some say, is a debatable approach.
It's basically telling the women that if they raise an equal pay case, they're going to punish the men as a result. It's a deterrent to women pursuing cases, and it makes them the villains rather than actually being the victims. Particularly strangely in the United States, it's actually very common to have clauses that ban pay cuts. So if an employer discovers a woman's being underpaid, they must raise the pay of the woman, not cut the pay of the men.
Carrie Gracie has accused the BBC of illegal pay discrimination, and tomorrow she will give evidence in Parliament. The BBC's balancing act isn't set to get any easier.
Helen Thomas there. Well, Fran Unsworth is the BBC's head of news. She'll be among those testifying at the Parliamentary Committee tomorrow. She's been in her job for a month, but was deputy for some time before that, and I spoke to her this evening. Does she really believe that when it comes to pay and news, gender is not an issue?
I don't think that's quite what the report says. The report says that PwC have done is that there's no systemic gender bias in the way that pay has been set. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't differences in men and women's pay. What the report is saying there is that gender has not been the basis of the decision making that people have used when they have set somebody's salary.
Isn't the real reason that you don't want to admit that gender has been an issue, a specific issue, is that that gets you into legal problems, and you then have to start paying back pay for 6 years to anyone who can show that they're a victim of it, and that's just too expensive for the BBC to contemplate without having nightmares.
Well, I think that what the report is saying is it might apply in some cases that there is an equal pay issue, but there's no systemic issue.
Can you imagine 6 years back pay for people in those cases where you think gender has been an issue?
If we have broken the law in an individual case, then we will have to address that, yes. I think that part of the reason, though, that there is this discrepancy in, because the gender pay gap is not the same as equal pay.
No, because that's two people in the same job earning very different amounts.
And some of the reasons why two people in the same job may be earning different amounts of money, The law says you have to justify it. So there might be justifiable reasons why two people in the same job are on different salaries. And those criteria will be around how long has the person been doing it, what is their profile with the audience, does the audience tune into the programme because of that person, in which case there is not an equal pay claim under the law. But of course those are things which have to be justified, and they might open to debate as well, of course.
A lot of the BBC argument has been the BBC was disproportionately employing men in the era when money was a little bit looser, and then diversity came along. BBC made a big effort on that, really just at a time when austerity was beginning to bite and the money was much tighter. Would you acknowledge there was systemic gender bias in the period, say, more than 5 years ago, when the BBC was recruiting more men, or a disproportionate number of men?
Quite possibly, although there might have been a smaller pool of women from whom to choose for all sorts of social reasons. And that's something that we have to address going forward.
In the Carrie Gracie case, and I don't want to focus too much on her, she's been at the BBC 30 years, Jeremy Bowen's been at the BBC 30 years, pretty different salaries. I mean, I wonder whether you think, as you look at the salaries, as you've gazed and eyeballed at them like everybody else did when many were published last year, did you not think, that looks strange, that looks a bit weird?
Yes, we did. We very much did, yes. These salary issues were a matter of individual negotiation up to a point. It was sort of within a framework. They were confidential matters, and we were not setting them vis-a-vis other people in quite the way that we should have done. And disclosure, I think, has thrown a very uncomfortable light on that for us, which needs to be addressed.
You had access to that data before the rest of the world did. So the rest of the world saw it last July and said, that looks a bit weird. You could have said that any time, you know, and you could have just looked at it and said, that looks a bit strange. And you were strangely incurious, I suppose, in not having raised this before.
Well, I think it's around really not having a proper framework in which to do it. And that's what this report introduces now, which says, this is, if you work on this type of programme, this is the type of salary that you can expect to be paid within a range, recognising various factors. And that's what we didn't do before. That's why I think a lot of women quite reasonably are saying this was not transparent.
Strange that you didn't even do it knowing that they were going to be published last July. You had, what, a year's warning or thereabouts that they would be published.
Well, I think there
Did you not even eyeball them and say, before the publication, we've got a problem looming here, we as the bosses ought to probably sort this out and make sure we've got something to say to staff who are obviously going to perceive anomalies all over the place, many of which appear quite gender specific?
I think there was a bit of that, but not enough, and I would accept the premise of your question that we should have been onto this earlier.
The eyes of the country are very much on the BBC and its pay formation at the moment, and people will be interested if the BBC finds a system that is replicable elsewhere. If you have this BBC system and you have a rate for a job, I don't know, presenter of the 10 o'clock news, and you've got a range for that job, and then you want to employ someone from outside who is on a higher salary than in that range, what do you do?
It's a really good question which we have thought of, and I think that we were taking the view that we will have to stick within the ranges broadly, but what has changed, I do believe, is the market for news presenters. Now, the BBC has been discounted anyway, according to the market, but I think that we will be continuing with that as a process.
But what you're saying is you will not employ someone higher than that range, and if they won't come for the going salary?
I think there will be more of that, yes, than there has been in the past, because if we don't apply that, that is how things do get very out of line.
Do you see over the next 5 years the BBC saving money or spending money on reforming its pay?
I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. That's probably, it might be that in the short term it's spending and in the long term it's saving. We haven't run the numbers on that. We're still hearing approximately 200 or odd cases. I do think, though, that this is going to be a fairer, more transparent, more justifiable to both the public and to our workforce way of paying people.
Fran Underworth, thank you very much.
Thank you.